all agree that inequality has got worse everywhere. I think I'll certainly argue that inequality has been always worse in the Anglo-Saxon economies than in the coordinated economies of Northern Europe.
Explain what those concepts mean.
So Anglo-Saxon.
Comprehensive exams, but I think
it's absolutely terrible, isn't it? I've really put on the spot now. So Anglo-Saxon economies, which include Ireland, by the way, and Israel. So I apologise to using the term Anglo-Saxon. There's an increasing sort of division in the political economy literature between the way in which the Anglo-Saxon economy, I'll just use the term Anglo-Saxon economies or liberal market economies are organised with relatively flexible labour markets, relatively short-term financial institutions with corporate governance where shareholders, as it were, have their thumb on CEOs, and CEOs are then given very high-powered incentives in terms of shares so as to align their interests in the jargon with the interest of shareholders. Where on the whole, education works through general education rather than through vocational training. And if we look at the countries of Northern Europe, we have a very different picture. We have labour markets which are much more regulated than in the Anglo-Saxon countries, though, as we'll see, there's been some deregulation in Northern Europe. We have corporate governance systems which are so-called block shareholder systems, where you have a relatively small group of owners who take a relatively long-term perspective on their equity in the companies, so-called patient capital. And we have in Northern Europe a really very extensive system of vocational training in one form or another, in whether it's through apprenticeships, whether it's through increasingly people going to two-year colleges or to universities, and in effect doing training in university, in higher education, which is very linked up to their future career. And so we still have today, although things have become more flexible everywhere, we still have very big differences between the economies, the Anglo-Saxon economies, the Anglo-Saxon world, and the economies of Northern Europe. Now, that clearly, we could say that's just some long going back culture, but we certainly, I would certainly want to say that reflects big differences in the institutions. I mean, I completely take Wolfgang's point that underlying those institutions are really, really important organisations, which, as it were, if you like, of which the institutions are constituted. If we go on to looking at further differences between this differences among Anglo-Saxon economies, between the degree of inequality in the United States. The United States really comes out as the bad guy. I'm sure you'll all be perfectly happy to know that that's the case. Anyway, it's official. I've said so. But it's difficult not to think that there are institutional elements which make these really massive differences between, just to take Canada and the United States, Canada really comes out pretty well, actually, on most of these inequality indicators, better than the UK does. Worse, much worse than Sweden, but really very much a good country in Anglo-Saxon terms. And America is the bad boy on the block as far as this is concerned. Now, I would like to say that we can explain this in terms of the way the American political system works, the extraordinary decentralization in the American political system, which gives a huge autonomy to basically actually to homeowners, who are the people who vote at local elections and who can take all these decisions. It's very clear if you look at the countries of Northern Europe, I mean, as we well know, the Scandinavian countries do significantly better than the Germanic countries do. And this difference has increased actually over the past 20 years rather than reduced. So is that, we might just say, well, that's because the Swedes are really, really very nice people compared with the Germans. That's not my experience of Germans and Swedes, by the way, at all. So one then might well say, well, maybe there are political differences in the way politics works, and that's actually what we should be looking at. And that then comes again back to institutions.
No society can sustain high levels of income inequality without everyone being badly impacted by that. And so they talk about how in societies where there are high levels of income inequality and income polarization, which when we think about the richest 1% breaking away from the rest of us, that's really a story of polarization as well. In all of these societies, people experience more stress. They lose hope. They lose their faith in their institutions, in each other. There's more crime. There's greater social unrest.
Obesity.
People are sicker. There's mental health issues, this sort of thing. So then when we say, okay, so income inequality is growing in many countries, and we know this is happening, and we know that it affects everyone. These are the sorts of things that happen. And how does this relate to democracies? Well, what we have is, in sociology, what they would call enemy. I mean, basically, people are losing hope. They're detaching. So when they look at their governments, they're not actually holding their governments to account on this issue. And the thing about democracies is that no democracy survives by letting it go on autopilot. That democracies have to be fought for and renewed continuously. And that's not just a matter of partisan politics. That's actually about citizens acting like citizens and engaging in their society and not simply acting as consumers. And our governments, for far too long, have been treating their citizens like they're consumers, and the best thing that I can offer you is a tax cut. When what the international literature shows is that in societies where governments actually play a stronger role in mitigating the inequalities that are embedded in the labor market, that it makes a big difference. So in a world where we go, well, it's globalization, it's what can you do? Actually, all the evidence is there that shows there's a lot that we can do. And it's our governments, but it's also we the people. Deep down, I am an optimist. I'll end with this little anecdote. This interesting question that Environics asked Canadians in a poll, because we all talked about taxes and the aversion to taxes among citizens. And they asked Canadians, what do you do that makes you feel like a good citizen? And they didn't give them a list of answers. It was an open-ended question. So the number one answer that Canadians said is, I volunteer. That makes me feel good. The number two answer was, I'm kind. Random acts of kindness. That makes me feel good. The number three answer? I pay taxes. So there is this deep value, and how we talk about it and how much we allow it to get pushed to the side matters.
We also have to sort of rephrase what we mean by a lack of equality, because it might in this case be a lack of recognition, to be recognized in a certain way as a certain identity, ethnic identity, for example, as well, and then withholding recognition might be one way of sort of doing inequality, I guess. And so I think talking a little bit more about sort of cultural issues and not just the strictly sort of material economic issues. People don't just accumulate strictly material or economic resources and capital in that sense, but also cultural capital, social capital, like that's all Pierre Bourdieu has written a great book, Distinction, on these matters. And so I think I would just say, let's try to broaden it, and let's not be too strictly economic about this.
Okay.
One more thing I think that I would be concerned about when it comes to the impact of inequality is really how economic inequality, and let's talk about economic inequality very narrowly, how that translates into political inequality. The influence of economic power on political decision making, I think that is a very important issue. The more exacerbated economic inequality becomes, and of course, are there any U.S. Americans in the room? Because okay.
We're going through all the stuff about Germany.
No, I was just going to say, I think the U.S. is a particular, problematic case because money translates so easily into political influence. But I think even in other political systems, that is a real problem that becomes aggravated, I think, the more economic inequality increases. And one last thing, and that's sort of a broader point, I think, and is more about sort of the sociology of democracy that might take a hit there. I think it's got to do, and I think you mentioned that already, David, things like residential segregation, for example, walled-in communities for the rich, the lack of a common democratic space, as grandiose as that may sound right now, it's just living together and interacting together across these various axes of inequality. These shared spaces might get lost in this process of more and more inequality. And I think that would be something that I'd be concerned about, because I think that's one of the preconditions for democratic practices that have to be learned and that can easily get lost, I think.
I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political scientist. I know there is a debate about middle class. As far as I can say, for UK, the middle class is vanishing. And it's very interesting because the difference between the point of view of sociologists and economists about that. Sociologists tend to say that it's not true, that the middle class in UK is more solid than in the past, because they look at the typology of work. But economists look at the remuneration of work, at wages and incomes. And if you look at the specific remuneration of the kind of job that the middle class white collar now have, they are very, very low. So really the middle class doesn't have income any longer. And the middle class is very important for democracy, but we will come to this topic later on. So this is one problem. A byproduct of inequality, let's say. And there are measures about the disappearing of middle class. There is an index of polarization, which, as far as I know, for UK, in my results, is indicating exactly this, that polarization increased, so middle class is vanishing. And the second point is about the social immobility, which is absolutely amazing now. I have some figures here. I was giving my handout to Kurt, but I don't think you have it. Glean, for instance, has a very striking graph on the correlation between sons and fathers' incomes for UK. Then there is the so-called Great Gatsby curve invented by Alan Kruger, yes, which correlates the inequality and the probability of remaining in the same income class, and it's a straight line, increasing straight line. And other proofs, like there is a matrix. That's very interesting. For instance, still for UK, This is a simulation, not for UK, sorry, for OECD countries. This is a simulation made by Yanti in 2006, and figures are striking because in UK and the United States, especially in UK and the United States, the probability of remaining very poor and very rich is huge. Something different is in the middle. So it's a sort of, paralysis in the top and bottom part of the distribution.
If I look back the last 20 years, my impression for the rich OECD countries is there is now, at least on an official discourse level, no tolerance for inequality if it comes to gender, if it comes to cultural discrimination. I don't want to say there are no injustices and inequalities, but the public discourse does not tolerate it anymore. But it tolerates now, during the last 20 years, much more socio-economic inequalities, which these societies would not have tolerated in the 1960s and 70s. Therefore, some of the people now writing about post-democracy, for example, are referring to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as the golden age of democracies, and now we are entering post-democratic stage. I think this is to a large extent wrong, but it is based on the observation that at that time, not only the institution, we were talking about the institution, I would like to add organizations. Organizations are before institutions. Who found these institutions? And if you look to the institutions which are important for redistribution beyond the market, then very much it comes to all the champions of redistribution of the 20th century's political parties and trade unions. And they did not disappear, but certainly they will not play a similar role in the 21st century. So the question of more socioeconomic equality, or put it the other way around, of less socioeconomic inequality, is the perspectives are not so rosy for the next decades to come, whereas I have great hopes that these gaps which still exist in race discrimination, cultural discrimination, gender discrimination, will have a much better future. And what would be interesting for us to discuss, not only the link between different institutions, organizations, it's very much about, I'm a political scientist, about power relations, the relation between capital and labor. And if we look back again the last 2 decades, there is a school in institutional economics, and the school talks about path dependency. There are certain events in history, critical junctures, which constitute a path, which is very difficult to change then in the future. And I would say one of these critical junctures we have seen, it's not only the Thatcher years and Reagan, certainly 1990s, the Washington Consensus. So inequality was politically produced to some extent.
I was a little bit worried that we were all going to be in agreement with each other, and that would be very dull. But it's been fascinating to see how this conversation has evolved, and you can see different perspectives, different ways of thinking about problems, and yet very complementary and leading to a really rich and interesting dialogue. So please join me in thanking our panel.